Welcome back, everybody. So the video essay for today is going to be on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. In particular, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhist philosophy. And this is sort of a very core set of ideas that is very much at the heart of Buddhist philosophy. And I'd like to just sort of walk you through them and why I think they're interesting and why they're important and why perhaps they're a little bit misunderstood. I'm going to focus in particular on the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, or suffering or unsatisfactoriness, not out of any cynicism or desire to rub our faces in the more unpleasant features of life, but more just because I've already talked quite a bit about meditation on this channel, which is a big part of the fourth noble truth. And my emphasis on the first noble truth today will more or less just reflect what I think is philosophically interesting about the core tenets of Buddhist philosophy. So the first thing we need to understand is that these truths, the term truth, satya in Pali or Sanskrit, means both truth and reality. So some scholars like Peter Harvey, for example, have translated the Four Noble Truths as the four ennobling realities. And the reason he wants to translate it in that way is because when a person understands these truths, they become noble. And that these truths are not just intellectual truths. They're not just features of propositional attitudes that we have that represent the world accurately. They are realities that need to be experienced and worked with in certain ways in order for freedom or liberation to be achieved. So the Buddha is portrayed as first disclosing these Four Noble Truths in the discourse, his first after becoming liberated from suffering, the discourse on the setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. And in this discourse, the Buddha returns to 5 ascetics that he had been practicing with previously and which he had left, realizing that harming the body to emancipate the spirit was not, in fact, a productive way to use one's attention and energy. And so he strives out on his own and discovers the Four Noble Truths and then comes back to his former colleagues to teach them. And the first noble truth is the truth of dukkha. Volumes of papers have been written about how to translate this term. It's often translated as suffering or misery, which can be somewhat misleading given that there are very subtle forms of dukkha that are not obviously miserable. Unsatisfactoriness, stress are other ways of understanding what this term denotes. But I think the best way to get a grip on it is to just go through some of the examples that are offered. And so in this discourse, the Buddha explains to the monks the following. He says that now this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. Now, that's quite a list. And from a philosophical perspective, I think the most interesting piece here is the last little summary sentence where he says, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. That last clause is peculiar for 2 reasons. First, the in short suggests that it is a summary for all the other forms of dukkha we've just listed out, which are far more obvious to our minds that they're not helpful things. No one wants to wallow in sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. No one likes to be dissociated from their loved ones or associated with people they despise. Those are obvious sufferings. But why would the 5 clinging aggregates be in short? In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. That's one thing that's interesting about it. And the second thing that's interesting about it, which follows immediately from the first, is that it's not obvious what that even means or why it would be dukkha. And so in order to unpack the relationship between these different parts of the list, we actually have to go a little deeper into the philosophical psychology of Buddhism and into some of the commentarial literature that sprung up in an attempt to clarify and precify what was going on in these discourses. So the first thing we have to do is understand the 5 aggregates. What are they? Most of you who will be watching this probably have some idea what the 5 aggregates are, so I'm not going to be super in-depth here. But in short, the 5 aggregates are one of the main conceptual schemas that Buddhists use to analyze the biophysical and psychological processes that constitute a human life. And it is at this level that we find the clinging that is referred to in short, the 5 clinging aggregates, or dukkha. So the 5 aggregates are the following. There's rupa, which means form, physical form, and it refers to the living body and its sensitivity to its environment. There's vedana, feelings or sensations, which refer to the part of the mind that is hedonic, the part of the mind that is capable of experiencing pleasure and pain and neutral feeling. Sanya or samnya in Sanskrit is the part of the mind that recognizes and categorizes the contents of experience. Sankhara or samskara is the part of the mind that reacts, the part of the mind that is sort of dispositionally primed to react to stimulus on the basis of its hedonic tone or its categorical label, vedana and sanya. And then there's vijnana, which means consciousness or discernment, discrimination, the part of the mind that knows the object that is the source of the stimulation. And Sankhara and vijnana have a very complex relationship, especially in the context of Buddhist metaphysics, in particular, the teaching of dependent origination, where we see this claim that all moments of consciousness are kind of buoyed upon, motivated by sankharic responsiveness or reactivity, and that the intentional relation of consciousness to its object is always structured by feeling and recognition or labeling or categorization. So the vedana and the sanya. And it is at this level that the Buddhists want us to understand the deepest, most pervasive and subtlest form of our existential predicament. But before we unpack that, we need to do the other levels. So Buddhist commentators in the Abhidharmic tradition tend to analyze dukkha into 3 levels. The first level is called dukkha, which is the dukkha of pain and obvious misery. And the time scale for this kind of suffering is occasional. There are extreme cases where people deal with chronic pain disorders, which can be harrowing. But for the most part, statistically at least, we should understand this form of dukkha to be awful and occasional. And the paradigm examples here taken from the list that we just read from are things like physical pain, mental anguish, the trials of aging, sickness, illness of various sorts, and death. Now, that sort of covers most of what we tend to mean by suffering, which is why the second and third levels of dukkha are so interesting and important for us to understand. So the second level is called viparinama dukkha, which is the dukkha of change and impermanence. And this is where the Buddhist analysis of suffering becomes distinctively Buddhist. So the core examples here are being separated from people that you love and being united with ones that you hate. So the lesson here, sad as it is that even the most pleasant situations in your life will eventually transform into unpleasant situations, because everything you love will eventually disappear. The opposite is also true, right? So this is where understanding dukkha can start to liberate you a bit, because no matter how awful something is, it will also change at some point. So you will be at some point or another united with what you despise and separated from what you love. And our attitudes toward these experiences, even though they're inevitable, is that we generate incredible longing for closeness with those that we love, especially when they're separated from us, and incredible agitation and aversion to those that we are forced to associate with, which we might not otherwise want to be around. And that's a kind of suffering, right? Like we want our experience to be otherwise than it is. And this leads us to the final level of dukkha, sankhara dukkha, which is the dukkha of constant conditionality. So one important contrast here, the first level of dukkha, the time scale, as I mentioned, is occasional. The second level of dukkha is frequent, right? Frequently, we are separated from people we love and associated with people that annoy us. But the sankhara dukkha, the dukkha of conditionality, is constant. Constant conditionality, constant suffering. This is the subtlest and most pervasive level of suffering according to Buddhist moral psychology. It is the part of suffering that is equated with the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. The point here is that there is a level at which we are constantly subjected to dukkha because of our own finitude and the very fabric of our embodied mental continuum is structured by certain habits and patterns of reactivity that create cognitive dissonance and subtle forms of agitation that pervade our experience with a kind of background existential malaise. And it is the persistent attitude, implicit attitude that we develop to this level of agitation that sort of filters upwards and impacts the level of reactivity we display in response to viparinama dukkha and to dukkha dukkha. That's the noble truth of dukkha. Each noble truth has a task associated with it, something that has to be done in order to internalize and properly understand the lesson embodied by each truth. The truth of dukkha must be completely understood at an experiential level. There are no shortcuts. The way out of your predicament is through it. The contrast here that's relevant to understanding what's being requested of us in the cultivation of an understanding of this truth is that rather than allowing our habitual reactions to various levels of dukkha to tacitly condition our actions, we must face directly the totality of our dukkha with a certain level of mindfulness, right? To cultivate a certain level of contemplative equipoise, which allows us to understand dukkha as dukkha in all of its pervasive subtlety, and to understand it as a causal phenomena, as something that is generated by its place in a complex causal matrix of which we have some limited form of agency. This leads us to the second truth, which is tanha, which means craving or thirst. Like the medical model, these 4 truths have a kind of medical slant to them. So dukkha is the symptom. Tanha is the diagnosis. What is the underlying cause of your symptom? Then the third truth will embody a kind of prognosis, a prediction about what will happen in the future. And then the fourth noble truth will embody what the prescription, right? The prescription of what to do about it. So let's look at the diagnosis of our dukkha. The diagnosis of dukkha is that there is a primal response embodied in our deepest sentience to the affective dimensions of experience. When we feel pleasure, we want more of it. When we feel discomfort, agitation, pain, we don't want it, we push it away. And when we feel neutral sensations that don't obviously prime us towards the pleasant or the unpleasant, we ignore them. We respond with a lustful attachment to pleasure, aversion to pain, and a kind of indifference to that which doesn't give us an explicit motivating push either way. The task of this particular truth is that it must be relinquished. And this is why scholars sometimes translate satya here as reality rather than truth, because we don't want to relinquish or abandon a truth. We want to relinquish or abandon the reality of craving. We want to give up that very phenomenon as it structures our cognitive emotional economy. We have this deep tendency to cling to things, to grab onto them or to push them away. Even, to grab onto things when they're bad for us, and to push things away that are good for us. And so we want to develop a kind of anchored, non-reactive awareness of this phenomena, and then to cultivate a kind of a detachment. And this level of detachment is something that I don't think is really emphasized in a lot of contemporary hype around Buddhist moral psychology and mindfulness, because it's a very radical form of detachment, which leads to our prognosis. If you become completely detached to the affective dimensions of your experience and habitual reactions to those affective dimensions of experience by relinquishing your craving, the prognosis is that you will achieve the experience of nirodha, the third noble truth, the truth of cessation, the cessation of dukkha. This is a truth whose task is to be experientially realized. And this is where the more common Sanskrit name of nirvana becomes operative. This is where dukkha ends. And this only happens when you completely let go of your craving. And I'm not going to say much about nirvana here, because this final goal of Buddhist practice is almost always characterized in negative terms, in terms of the absence of craving, the absence of defilement, the absence of death. But other than that, it's very difficult to say anything positive about it, because it is the absence of conditions, of conditioned experience. And one of the conditions of possibility for linguistic reference is conditions. So that's how language works, right? Language is a kind of exchange of information. There's a reference structure in place. These are conditions, and the experience of the deathless, as the Buddhists like to say, anatta, is beyond that. So there are certain paradoxes associated with even referring to it, and I'm not much moved by these, so I'm not going to get into it. Instead, I want to get to the prescription of that is associated with this prognosis, which is the truth of the path. The path that leads to the cessation of dukkha, which is something that must be developed. Okay, and the Noble Eightfold Path has 8 parts and 3 divisions, and it must be cultivated in order for the fruit of cessation of dukkha to be realized. This path is a way of living, and thus embodies a kind of practical approach to life rather than a theory, right? It is heavily prescriptive. Like, these are the things you need to do. You need to develop your panya, or your prajna, your insight, your understanding, your wisdom, which is constituted by right view and right intention. Right view means to have the kind of right perspective, that you're interpreting your experience according to a proper framework. And your intention is correct when you are resolved to renounce certain attitudes and behaviors that lead to bondage, that lead to further conditioning of dukkha. So you want to be resolved on a kind of renunciative, transcendent attitude, to be free from ill will and cruelty. And when you have that kind of intention, and that intention is deployed against the backdrop of correct view, then you are starting to develop the beginning stages of insight, understanding, or wisdom, which is various ways of translating panya in Pali, or prajna in Sanskrit. The second division is sila, morality, skillfulness. This division has 3 parts: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. These are fairly mundane commitments, but they're important because they represent a thesis in the moral psychology of Buddhist philosophy, to the effect that in order to cultivate a mind that is calm enough to cut through its own conditioning, you have to have established a kind of moral equilibrium with your world. And in order to do that, you need to have helpful, skillful habits of speech. Your action needs to be tamed in certain ways, and you can't be making a livelihood that makes others suffer. So right speech is that you want to refrain from lying, harsh words, unskillful words, idle speech, gossip, things of that nature. Right action is the abstaining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And right livelihood is to live by begging as a monk, or as a householder, you must avoid making money at the expense of suffering of other sentient beings. When you've established moral equilibrium with your environment, that will enable you to develop the third division of the path, samadhi, concentration of mind. which is constituted of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right effort is the effort to cultivate and maintain wholesome mental states, to prevent and eradicate unwholesome mental states. Right mindfulness is to meditate on the 4 satipatthanas, the 4 foundations of mindfulness practice: the body, feelings, the certain structures and moods that arise in the mind, and certain mental structures which, when cultivated and analyzed, help the awareness get really poised for absorption into right concentration, which is the development of one-pointed meditative concentration, or jnana, which is the basis for insight, the bringing back in of prajna or panya, on the basis of jnanic absorption, which leads to purification of the mind, that emancipates, that leads to liberation. That's very quickly, very broadly, the 4 Noble Truths. Now, one thing I like to do when I'm talking about these things is to just point out that what's being asked of us here on a psychological level and a philosophical level is quite extreme. And I think that sometimes the philosophical severity of Buddhist moral psychology is lost on us in our modern attempts to render the teachings of Buddhism salient to a scientific audience, to a perhaps atheist audience, to a modern Western audience. And that's fine. Religions evolve, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the philosophical core of Buddhist moral psychology is radical. It is radical in the sense that it advocates certain attitudes and cultivation of certain mental states, which are quite contrarian to the habitual modes of comportment and attitudes that we tend to live in our daily life. That the solution to our existential predicament, the solution to the problem of suffering, is intense. It is not easy. It is not simple. It has the surface grammar of elegance and simplicity, but the actual project of engaging your own cognitive emotional economy and reprogramming its habits at the deepest level is a rather serious endeavor. And I think that this is something that we all need to keep in mind in our enthusiasm, rightfully so, of Buddhism and its practices. Okay, everybody, take good care. Bye for now.